Scot Marciel is a visiting scholar and practitioner fellow at Stanford University. With a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a bachelor's in international relations from the University of California in Davis, he most recently served as the United States Ambassador to Myanmar from March 2016 through May 2020. Prior to his assignment in Myanmar, Ambassador Marciel was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the State Department, where he oversaw U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. Our ambassador has more than 35 years of experience as a diplomat. His area of specialization is Asia and around the world as well. In addition to the assignments noted above, he has worked on U.S. missions in Turkey, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Brazil, and the Philippines. At the State Department, he served as Director of the Office of Maritime Southeast Asia, Director of the Office of Mainland Southeast Asia, and Director of the Office of Southern European Affairs. Today, he will be addressing the current events in Myanmar and focus on the nearly unprecedented national resistance to the military's coup and how things might progress going forward. With this, Ambassador Marciel, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Ruz. Thanks for everyone for taking time to join and to talk a little bit about Myanmar, a place, as you said, where I spent 4 years of my life as ambassador, and a place that where I have a lot of dear friends, many of whom are right now under detention by the military. So it's not only professional, but tremendous personal interest and personal attachment. Let me begin, and with apologies to those who may already know this, just a little bit about Myanmar as a country and some of the historical background. I'm not going to go into ancient history, but recent years, because it's really impossible to discuss or understand what's happening now without knowing a little bit of the recent history. So Myanmar is formerly known as Burma, is right on the Indian Ocean, and it borders China to the northeast and India to the northwest. So two huge countries right on its borders. Immediately west is Bangladesh, immediately east is Thailand. It's a country of about 4 million people. And one of the most important things to understand about Myanmar is it's what at least one historian has called an incomplete nation. And what I mean by that is it's a country that's very diverse, many different ethnic communities there, that has never really figured out how all those communities can live together as one nation. So throughout its history, it became independent in 1948. Throughout its history, there's been two consistent struggles that have gone on. One, the one that most people in the West might be familiar with, is the struggle between the forces of the pro-democracy forces, led by Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, and the military. But the other one, equally important and equally relevant right now, is a struggle between the majority so-called Bamar, ethnic Bamar people, who tend to inhabit the heartland, the center of the country, and literally hundreds of ethnic minority groups who tend to dominate population-wise in the border areas. And there have been more than 24 insurgencies that have been going on for decades. Insurgencies involving these different ethnic minority groups fighting against the central government, basically for either independence or a high degree of autonomy. And so those two struggles have really framed the history. The military took over in a coup actually way back in 1962, at a time when Burma then was actually doing reasonably well by the standards of the region. And they enacted a series of isolationist socialist policies that really drove the country into the ground over the next 25 years. And the military maintained power fully up until about 2010, 2011. So you had military that controlled things politically, but also very much economically, and was extremely repressive. People who disagreed with the military were thrown in prison if they were lucky. And the military carried out really brutal operations against all of these different ethnic insurgent groups with just horrific human rights violations, again, going over decades. So Myanmar is known to have probably the world's longest running civil war. This has all been going on since the 40s, since independence, really. And that background is really important to understand. And there's tremendous mistrust between the different ethnic groups, particularly between the dominant so-called Burma ethnic group, which is largely Buddhist, and all of the different ethnic minority groups. The country under the military has really been dominated by the Burma, with a fair amount of discrimination and a lack of respect for the culture and history of these ethnic groups. So let me fast forward a little bit to get us closer to today. In 2010, the country had elections that I was working on Myanmar at the time, we all saw as just another kind of joke election that would allow the military to keep power under a 2008 constitution that the military had written. The democratic forces boycotted that election. The pro-military candidates, if you will, won easily. And then a strange thing happened. The new government from that election in 2011 began to enact reforms, really unprecedented reforms, to open up the country, which had been very isolated, to allow political participation, the formation of political parties, independent press, civil society. They released virtually all of the what had been thousands of political prisoners in the country. A lot of economic reforms opened up to the world, to us, including the United States. It was a huge surprise, and a really positive surprise that we think was largely driven by the military's recognition that it was too isolated and that it was becoming too dependent on China, which had supported the military government. So from 2011 to 2015, you had, as I said, a period of pretty unprecedented reform that really changed so much about the country. You had, where you had no hope, you had hope. Where you had no opportunity, you had opportunity, economic and otherwise. People began being able to travel. They had access to information. Before 2010, when I would visit, good luck getting any internet access. You would get that old, slow dial-up internet that might or might not work. And they liberalized the telecom sector, and pretty rapidly people had access through really Chinese-made smartphones to the internet. Everybody got on Facebook, became one of Facebook's biggest customer countries. So all of this happened in a very brief period of time, leading to 2015, when you had, again, national elections. And in those national elections, the military aligned party thought that, well, we've done pretty well. We've made all these reforms. We're going to win. We should win. And instead, they were trounced by Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy party, as the people overwhelmingly voted against further military or military-aligned rule and in favor of the longtime pro-democracy party. My sense is that the military wasn't expecting this. They carried out the reforms, had initiated the reforms, I think believing that they could control the process and maintain power. So you have this new government that took office in early 2016 that was, it had over 100 members of parliament were former political prisoners. Aung San Suu Kyi really led the government. She had been under house arrest for many, many years. So it was a pretty dramatic change. And there was a lot of euphoria in the air, certainly in the country. Those of us in the United States and in the West were also very encouraged, both by the previous reforms and by the prospect of further reforms with the pro-democracy party now running things. Now, that said, despite all the progress, the country still faced enormous problems. One, under the 2008 military written constitution, the military maintained a lot of power. It had 25% of the seats in parliament, and the military commander-in-chief had the authority to name key ministers. Excuse me, my phone's ringing. The military wasn't accountable to the civilian authorities at all, so they could basically do what they wanted. Nonetheless, the elected government proceeded to run things from 2016 to 2020. There were some positive things, there were some negative things. It turned out not to be as reform-minded as we had anticipated, and as many people in Myanmar had anticipated. And also in 2017 and 2018, you had military operations against one particularly discriminated against minority community, the Rohingya, which is a Muslim community whose forefathers had arrived in Myanmar generations earlier from Bangladesh. And it's a community that's long faced institutionalized discrimination. The military carried out a pretty brutal campaign that we called ethnic cleansing, drove 700,000 to 800,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh. And Aung San Suu Kyi's government, which we had expected to be a champion for human rights, basically didn't say much and even defended the military's actions, which created a lot of upset around the world. I'm going to fast forward again. In November 2020, the country again had national elections. Again, the military-aligned party thought that they would do pretty well, given some disappointment with Aung San Suu Kyi's government. Once again, they were wrong, and the ruling NLD party won an even larger landslide than it had in 2015. And this is kind of where we get into how the coup happened and why the coup happened. The election wasn't perfect. There were a certain number of people who were disenfranchised and some other flaws, but the international observers who were there, and there were quite a few of them, all said that it reflected the will of the people, that the NLD had won a clear victory, really without any question. Nonetheless, the military began to question the legitimacy of the elections, claiming massive fraud where there was no evidence of, and really pushing the NLD government to allow the military to review the election results and possibly even hold new elections. The Aung San Suu Kyi and company rejected that, I think correctly. There was no justification for the military's pressure. And this is what led to the coup on February 1st. My sense is that the coup was the result of a couple of factors. You can forget the claims of electoral fraud. They were bogus. But I think the military perhaps was concerned, even though it still had a lot of power constitutionally, was concerned that the elected government would try to strip away some of its power. It was, I think, angry, maybe even humiliated, both by the scale of the defeat and by the fact that the government had refused to take seriously its allegations of fraud. And again, this is a military that's used to having its way. So they're not used to civilians saying no to it. And third, the military commander-in-chief, General Min Aung Hlaing, a very ambitious man himself, was due to retire in July and was pushing hard for a senior position in the government, which was rejected. And I think he had his own personal ambitions probably played a role in this coup. So the coup happened. The military has all the guns, so they were able to affect the coup without too much problem. They detained Aung San Suu Kyi, the President Win Myint, many members of parliament, and many others. And I think what the military had in mind was to follow the example of their neighbor Thailand, which in 2014 had staged a coup. The military there had staged a coup. And they had, over the next couple of years, had prosecuted some of the most popular politicians to sort of move them out of the political picture. They changed the election rules to make sure that they would win in a new election. Then they'd held elections and said, wow, we've got an elected government that just happens to be a lot of former military people. And I think that's really what the military had in mind when they staged this coup. They did not anticipate or expect the incredible negative response throughout the country to the coup by the population. And I can tell you from my time there, people in Myanmar, like people everywhere, there were a lot of divisions, a lot of disagreements about many things. The one thing that just about everybody agreed on is they didn't want to go back to military rule. Because during its 50 years of rule, as I said, the military had really driven the country into the ground. I mean, this is a country that had been relatively well off, well educated, etc. And by the time the military had ruled for 50 years, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. The education system, the healthcare system had been largely destroyed. There had been no peace for decades. It was highly repressive. People didn't have access to information, these sorts of things. So nobody wanted to go back to that. And I think another factor was people had had a taste of liberty. They, particularly younger people, had grown up, been able to go to university, been able to read independent media, speak their minds to a large extent. And they were just adamant that they did not want to go back to military rule. So what's happened since then? I don't want to call it some people have called it the opposition. I don't want to call it the opposition because it sort of suggests that they were the losers in the election when in fact they won. I'll just say the public as a whole has resisted the coup in a couple of ways. One, widespread protests. It started off quite large. They've gotten smaller as the military has cracked down violently on them. But two, even more importantly, I think, is a widespread civil disobedience movement where people are refusing to work, including many, many civil servants who are refusing to work for this military junta. And their goal is to make the country ungovernable as a way of pressuring the military to change course, go back to the barracks, these sorts of things. The military has responded with just appalling brutality, indiscriminate violence, shooting live rounds into protests, and literally just terrorizing the population. As I said, almost indiscriminately, killing men, women, children, arresting thousands, torturing many of them to death. So people get picked up and then arrested, and the next day their tortured bodies are deposited back to their families' houses. It's a clear effort by the military to terrorize the population into submission. It's horrific. So that's obviously just been really ugly and painful to watch. Now, the other thing that's happened that's really important here is that because so many of the leaders of the government and political leaders have been arrested, this movement to resist the coup is almost leaderless, or it's led by dozens, if not hundreds of people, many of them from a younger generation, which makes it really interesting. And one positive that's come out of this, and there's very few positives, is that, remember I talked about this incomplete nation and this distrust between the Burma majority and the ethnic minorities. what's happened in the last few months is the beginning of some recognition on the part of the protesters, the leaders of the civil disobedience movement and others, many of whom, but not all of whom, are ethnic Burma, that they said, we've been listening for years to our ethnic minority colleagues talk about the brutality of the military. And we tended to believe the government propaganda that it was made up. But now we're victims of it ourselves. So now we belatedly recognize and appreciate what our ethnic brothers and sisters have been suffering for so long. So there's some sympathy there, and the beginnings of a recognition that we need to look at each other differently as citizens of Myanmar. We need to stop saying Burma versus other ethnic groups and look at each other as all working together. So this is a quite promising development, even if it's going to take many years to come to fruition. The other thing that's happened is the forces resisting democracy, resisting the coup, excuse me, particularly some of the parliamentarians who'd been elected and escaped arrest. They formed a committee to represent the parliament, and that committee, working together with some of the ethnic armed groups, has put together just in the last week or so a national unity government, a very diverse national unity government, which is being set up as, in their view, the legitimate government of Myanmar. And they're asking the world to recognize it, not the military created junta that took over after the coup. Now, this national unity government doesn't really have, they don't control any real territory. Some of them are operating in areas controlled by ethnic armed groups, but many of them are on the run, literally shifting from safe house to safe house on a regular basis. So that's kind of where things stand. One other important point, because of the civil coup and the civil disobedience movement and all the instability, the economy, which was already spiraling down because of COVID, is really fallen off a cliff. People are suffering greatly because there's no jobs. It's hard to even get food. It's a real struggle for survival for millions of people. The combination of the weak economy and the military violence has led to a flow of people seeking refuge in India and Thailand. A number have been able to cross into India. The Thai government, excuse me, the Thai government has so far said that it would be willing to accept people, but in practice it hasn't. So that's a really concerning issue. The international response to this, I think you can divide it into two broad camps. One, if you will, the Western camp, although it's not only Western, led by the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, but including, I'd say, Japan, Korea, and a number of other countries, is appalled by what's happened and has rejected the coup, has imposed sanctions against the military to try to squeeze the flow of revenue that the military needs to keep going, and to put maximum pressure on the military to withdraw from power. Many other countries, China, to some extent India, some of the Southeast Asian countries in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I wouldn't say they're necessarily in favor of the coup, but basically they're willing to live with it and to work with the military. And so those countries are blocking international action through the United Nations and so on. There's a summit meeting this Saturday of ASEAN leaders. For those who don't know, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 Southeast Asian nations, including Myanmar. ASEAN is saying, you know, this is a squabble within our family, so let us try to solve it. But they have agreed to let the commander-in-chief of the military, who led the coup, represent Myanmar at this summit, which is a troubling sign. And there's fear that they will sort of utter a few words calling for an end to violence, but not really put any muscle behind it or any punitive actions behind it. So this is going to be an important thing to see. So the question is, well, there's a couple of questions. One, where does this go from here? And it's really unpredictable. Some people have said, well, there's no way the military loses. They've got 300,000 soldiers. They're brutal. They're pretty united. There's no signs of a military split. They dominate on the weapons front, and they're willing to use them. But I think what we've seen over the last 2 months is the Myanmar people are not giving up. So I think the likelihood is a long, drawn-out struggle, mostly peaceful on the part of those resisting the coup, although some have begun to take up arms. So there's some concern about broader violence. So my expectation is this continues with things on the ground just getting worse, more refugees, more economic pain, more suffering, more violence by the military, more people detained. People have talked about Myanmar becoming a failed state. It's really ugly looking if nothing changes. And the question is for Americans, okay, it's a long ways away. It's literally halfway around the world. Why should we care? I have my personal reasons for caring because I have a lot of friends there, but beyond that, I think there's several. One is just on a purely humanitarian basis. Americans don't like to see people suffer. And thousands of people have been arrested. Several hundred have been killed by the military, often in just the most horrific fashion. Thousands more are fleeing, and millions are at risk of severe malnutrition, if not starvation, have lost their jobs. You're going to likely have refugee flows, which will create strains in neighboring countries. So you have that humanitarian issue. Second, related, it is the moral issue. I mean, we like democracy. We think people should be able to choose their own government. And this is one of the most blatant power grabs by a completely illegitimate institution I've ever seen in my life. You had just had elections which overwhelmingly brought back to power the party that had been ruling before in free and fair elections, democratically elected. And just 2 months later, the military, which is basically hated by the population, says, no, we're taking over. It's appalling. And the people are risking their lives, in some cases losing their lives, to fight to get democracy back. And that's something I think Americans always want to support. Third, there is a question of US leadership. They're looking to the United States. They've always looked to the United States. They know China's not going to stand up for democracy. So they look to us. And in addition to the moral issue, I think as we show them that we are standing with them, it will also help us build a good long-term relationship. Assuming over time democracy or something close to democracy prevails, people will remember that we were on their side. So we have an interest in that sense in supporting them. Strategically, as I mentioned, the country is located between China and India. China wants to dominate, wants to have maximum influence, wants to minimize our influence. I don't blame China for the coup, but they'll certainly try to take advantage of it. They'll be willing to work with the military. So if the military prevails, this will be an advantage for China. China's interest is they see a corridor. They want to build infrastructure, rail lines, roads. They already have an oil and gas pipeline leading to a port that they're building through Myanmar on the Indian Ocean, which would give them access to the Indian Ocean. Commercially, that's fine, but the risk that it becomes military access is of strategic importance to the United States. So that's another factor. And last, and this is a bit esoteric, but the relationship with ASEAN. ASEAN is a really important institution for the United States. It represents 10 countries, 600 million people, cumulatively the 5th largest economy in the world, a hugely important partner for us. With Myanmar as a member, if this coup government is able to represent Myanmar in ASEAN, it's going to be very difficult for us to work effectively or as closely as we would like with ASEAN. So it's going to hurt our interest in the rest of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, these sorts of things. So that's, you know, yet one more reason why I think we have an interest in how this plays out. As I said, next steps, we have an ASEAN Summit meeting on Saturday. I think expectations are relatively low for what that's going to produce, but we'll see. The UN Security Council is continuing to meet on this. The United States continuing to step up pressure. Secretary of State Blinken announced just today additional sanctions against military-owned companies that, again, sources of revenue for the military. The sanctions, I have to admit, are of limited effectiveness because Myanmar military is not doing a lot of business with the United States anyway. But it does send a message when the US imposes sanctions on these companies. It makes everybody else, particularly in the West, but in places like Japan, Korea, Singapore, think twice about doing business with these entities. So the hope is over time we add to the pressure through these sanctions on the military to look for a way out. I'm not sure what the way out is because neither the military nor the population at large seems interested at all in sitting down and trying to negotiate something. For them, this is a zero-sum game. Either we win or you win, I think. So to me, it's hard to be optimistic in the short term, easy to be pessimistic. My hope is that the military will feel so much pressure that inside the military, I don't think you'll have major splits, but you may get some people saying, maybe we should look for a way out of this. I'm not predicting that happens, but that's the best hope. Otherwise, more than likely, you will see a continuation of violence, instability, and a country that's literally just going steeply downhill with all kinds of ramifications for the region. Let me stop there. I could go on, but I think this is maybe a good place to stop, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This was wonderful, very enlightening. We have some first questions, and I would encourage everyone to, if you have something, write it in the Q&A box rather than the chat, if you would. It's a little easier to follow along. But our first question is, what other sanctions, and you just talked a little bit about the economic sanctions, what other sanctions or how else can foreign governments like the United States pressure the Myanmar military?
Yeah, it's a good question. Financial sanctions, economic sanctions would be great, but it's always really hard to get many countries to go along with that for a whole host of reasons. I spent big parts of my life banging my head against various brick walls and trying to convince countries to pursue sanctions. I think very important is the question of recognition and acceptance of this regime. It's important from the regime, the military coup regime really wants legitimacy. They want to be accepted. They want to be recognized. And the National Unity Government also very much wants to be. On a who's right and wrong morally, it should be no question the National Unity Government is a much more legitimate entity. But it's really complicated to recognize a government that doesn't have power. For example, for the United States, if we were to recognize the National Unity Government, there's a good chance that the military would force our embassy in Myanmar to leave, which means we would lose our ability to be on the ground, witness what's going on, continue small-scale assistance programs that benefit the people, that sort of thing. But I think it's important that, and this will be key at the summit, ASEAN Summit this Saturday, that other governments not make it clear that they are, even if they talk to the generals, they're not accepting or recognizing this coup. and that they continue to talk with the national unity government, even informally. It's hugely important to maintain the morale of the Myanmar public.
Thank you. Marcus would like to know, why did a Nobel Prize winner support the military as she did?
Boy, I wish I had the answer to that. The Rohingya issue is so complex and hard to understand. Basically, the Rohingya community was about a little over a million people inside Myanmar. Because of years of propaganda by the military government, many people, probably the vast majority of Myanmar people in the country, saw the Rohingya as illegal immigrants and a threat to the sort of Buddhist soul of Myanmar. And the public as a whole was quite supportive of military efforts to push them out of the country. So politically, it was a loser for Aung San Suu Kyi to support the Rohingya. Second is, I think they started believing their own propaganda. The government and the military were in denial. There were widespread human rights allegations against the military when it operated against the Rohingya. The government and the military both denied them, calling them, quote, fake news. I think they believed it after a while, even though there was overwhelming evidence of really horrific and widespread abuses. They began literally just listening to each other and thinking that the world had ganged up against them. So a certain amount of conspiracy theory belief. None of that excuses, in my view, her failure to stand up for the Rohingya, because her voice would have really mattered. People would have really listened to her. So it's an ugly episode for her and for the country.
Yes. Did the Obama administration have anything to do with the 2011 reforms? And then did the Trump administration do anything to stop the military atrocities?
On the first question, to some extent, yes. The Obama administration in 2009, after years of just sanctions and not really engaging with the Myanmar government, we still maintain sanctions, but we began to engage with them. I went a couple times to Myanmar and met with representatives of the government. We began to engage them and encourage reform. I don't want to say that therefore they carried out reforms, but it may have helped them feel like if they carried out reforms, there would be positive response. So it probably encouraged indirectly. Then once the reforms began, the Obama administration, the president sent Secretary of State Clinton to Myanmar early on to talk with the government and Aung San Suu Kyi, who by then had been released, and to sort of figure out how we could support the reform movement. So we launched, set up a USAID mission, began providing assistance, and many other things to encourage further reforms. So I would say we supported the reforms. Under the Trump administration, well, the military atrocities against the Rohingya, if that's what you mean, I mean, we spoke out very strongly. We sanctioned military leaders. We tried to work with others in the UN to get action taken against them. We contributed greatly to efforts to gather evidence for potential international criminal action against the military. So all of those things, yes.
Thank you. Gail would like to know, since India is a democracy, why do you think it is willing to live with this military coup?
Good question. I think it's a couple of factors. One is, and obviously I can't speak for the Indian government, but one, they have huge strategic interests in Myanmar. They don't want it to be dominated by China. And so that's probably factor number one. Two, there is a small active insurgency operating in northwestern Myanmar against India, and India very much needs the cooperation of the Myanmar military to combat that insurgency. And here, the third, I'm guessing, my sense is that there's been quite a bit of debate in India since the coup about this, and quite a bit of criticism of the government for being a little too soft on the coup. And that has led the government, I think, explains why the government has shifted somewhat and taken a somewhat more critical stance recently against the coup.
Razak has a question, and I'm going to read it. Dear Ambassador, since you described the country is with diverse ethnic minority groups, including Rohingya, do you think the military rulers may manipulate the ethnic divisions among groups to suppress the pro-democracy movements and keep the military rule?
I'm smiling because it sounds like Razak knows a lot about Myanmar. That's exactly what the military there has done for decades, divide and rule. So yes, they're certainly trying to do that. And one of the major efforts of this new national unity government and the broader resistance movement is to try to engage with the ethnic minority groups and kind of create a, if you will, it's a communist term, so forgive me, but a united front against the military. It's been mixed success. Some of the ethnic armed groups have clearly aligned with and expressed support for the protesters. Others have either stayed quiet or at least tilting a little bit toward the military, thinking maybe this is my chance to cut a good deal with the military. So this is one of the big challenges, certainly.
The next question is, I like it. You told us about why should it matter for the US, right? And so Christy is asking, what suggestions do you have for US citizens to help from a humanitarian aspect?
Yeah, I think there's a need for, I'm not allowed to do, I still work for the US government, so I should have said that at the beginning. So I can't do anything that suggests fundraising. But what I know is that a number of organizations are collecting funds, reputable organizations are collecting funds to funnel into the country just in support of people, just so they get food and the most essential things. I think that's probably the most helpful thing that people as individuals can do, is to try to provide support that way. Beyond that, it's you know, I get asked, you know, how can we put pressure on the US government to do more? My sense is that the US government is fully committed on this. It's not a matter, they don't need to be pressured because I think they're fully on board on this. But I think from a purely humanitarian point of view, trying to help people get some food and medicine would be probably the most useful thing.
Thank you. Speaking about pressure towards the government, how does the United States reconcile its relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi's pro-democracy party and its culpability in the Rohingya genocide?
Yeah, I spent a few years of my life dealing with that. I think it's this. The way I look at it is Myanmar was moving in an overall positive direction. Then it had this horrific action against the Rohingya, which was inexcusable, unacceptable, and we made it very clear that was. I don't think it's a matter of relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD so much as it is support for the broader effort of the population of the country to say, we want to fight for more democracy and we want to resist military rule. So it's not lining up with Aung San Suu Kyi per se or her party, but it's lining up with the cause of democracy, even though it's a very flawed democracy. Line up with the people of the country who have made it clear they don't want to be ruled by the military. Now, all the people who are against the military coup, many of them are supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi, but many are not. So by supporting the people who are resisting the coup, it's not necessarily, oh, we're just supporting this, going back. There's no going back to pre-coup. that mold has been broken. I don't know what will emerge if the military is forced out, but I think it will be something different. And I think, as I said, you're seeing the beginnings of people in the country acknowledging that they were blind to what happened to ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya. You've seen all kinds of people literally in the protests holding up signs. Dear Rohingya people, I apologize. I did not support you. I should have. So, I mean, I don't want to get into US politics, but, you know, like our issues with race and so on, it's not, you know, you flip a coin or you turn on a switch and suddenly you have democracy and everything's perfect. It's a process of building. And I think what we want to be doing is supporting that process and supporting the people who are trying to build it in as healthy a way as possible.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat, and it's actually a question that I kind of had as well. And this is a minor point, but very interesting with the two names, Burma, Myanmar. And so Kevin would like to know, do you think that the increasing use over time of Myanmar instead of Burma has helped normalize and thus legitimize the existing regime?
No, I don't. And I'll explain why. Back in the days of military dictatorship, the military changed the name from Burma to Myanmar. At that time, the democratic opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi asked us not to use that because that change was made by an illegitimate government. So that's why we didn't call it Myanmar officially. Once you had elections that brought in a democratic government, they sort of said that, okay, that's fine. We don't need to worry about that anymore. Myanmar, everybody in Myanmar calls it Myanmar. So let's just go with that. And so we officially still call it Burma. And I call it Myanmar. I always did when I was in Myanmar. And it's not a benefit to the military because I'm sure 90% of the people out on the streets protesting against the military use Myanmar. Very few people use Burma inside the country.
Okay, so it's politically okay to say Myanmar.
It is. It's no longer sort of tainted as linking yourself to the military. That's right.
That makes sense. Somebody else would like to know, you've talked about humanitarian fundraising. Is there anything else we can do to help?
I think, you know, raising awareness is important because there's so many things in the news. This isn't getting, I mean, I'm reading about it constantly, but that's because I'm linked to all kinds of people who are following it, but it's not getting that much attention. I think more attention for it is really helpful. So just having programs like this. So I really enjoy doing programs like this because it's really, I think for Americans, you know, we always like to be on the side of even the underdogs who are really fighting for things that are our values, you know, like basic rights and freedoms and democracy. So it's really a compelling case. And when you see the young people there who are out there risking their lives, I know a lot of them, they look to the United States, not that they expect us to solve it, but they see us as the country that's always been on their side. And I think making more people aware of what a dramatic situation it is and how important it is that the world, including the United States, pay more attention to it and do everything possible to help the people. Everything we can contribute to that is really important.
Thank you. The next question, Jeffrey is asking, if the military's hold to power becomes permanent, how does this impact the global economy and international markets, especially since China looks to benefit more from this coup? And what is the plan of the US to address this? Yeah,
I'm not sure it's going to have a huge impact on the global economy. The Myanmar economy is pretty small. You know, it's a $60 billion economy. I mean, it's small. If you count all the things like all the illegal narcotics, by the way, Myanmar is the largest producer of methamphetamines in the world. And that was largely the result of the military cutting deals with armed groups to let them produce drugs in return for peace. But still, it's a $100 billion economy. It's not going to affect the world economy very significantly. I'm not sure that China benefits from this, certainly in the short term, because I don't think the military might be able to hold on to power through just brutal suppression. That's different from being able to effectively govern. So far, they are not able to effectively govern the country. They can't even get civil servants to come to work. So I think as long as that is the case, you have great instability, which makes it really hard for China to go ahead with its big infrastructure projects. It's just too unstable, too much violence. So I think military staying in power does not equal stability and governance that would allow China to take advantage of it. I think instead what you have is something closer to a failed state with refugees and narcotics and conflicts spilling across borders and just making a mess of things, creating more problems, more refugees, for example. I think that's the bigger issue.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you. In your opinion, what is the likelihood of building an international coalition to combat the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Muslims in Asia? So both in China and Myanmar, particularly since China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Yeah, it's really hard to build widespread international coalitions on anything. It's just really hard. Governments find reasons to sort of bury their heads in the sand or just look the other way. I think I think the situation facing the Rohingya in Myanmar and the Uyghurs in China is quite different. China, and I'm not a China expert, so I won't say too much, but China uses its economic and political leverage very effectively to discourage governments from speaking out on this. Basically, it will punish them economically if they do. And so a lot of governments are just afraid. Even governments in Muslim majority countries often are staying quiet because they know there'll be retribution from China. You don't have that in the case of Myanmar. And you did have a pretty significant, I wouldn't call it a coalition, but a pretty significant number of countries that have spoken out loudly against the persecution of the Rohingya and continue to do so. But again, even if you have all those countries doing that, you go to the UN Security Council, China and Russia have veto, and they use it. So it is very difficult to do much in that sense.
Yeah, the next question is actually very related. Talking about the UN Security Council, what can be done to get the UN involved, especially if there is the gridlock in the UN Security Council?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have a couple of things. You have the UN Secretary General, who's been quite outspoken on this issue. Some have asked him to get more involved personally. You have a UN Special Envoy, Ambassador Christine Schreiner-Bergner from Switzerland. She's out in the region right now. She'll be meeting with the ASEAN leaders before their summit. She's been very outspoken, calling for the international community to stand up against this coup. So she will be doing all she can on that front. Then you have the UN Human Rights Council and others, and there is a UN investigative mission that was set up after the Rohingya issue, which is collecting evidence, criminal evidence of crimes against humanity and the like, to use against the perpetrators in the Myanmar military. I mean, that's a long, slow process, but that's been underway for a few years, and it's now looking at post-coup violence as well. You have a case in the international, now I'm blanking on it, the World Justice Court, that was brought by the Gambia a few years ago against Myanmar for the alleged genocide against the Rohingya. So that's underway. So you have already a lot of international mechanisms in place. The trouble is, you know, they don't move quickly, particularly when it gets into legal matters. It just takes time to collect the evidence. It's a period of years. But that's, you know, the UN is involved in all of those things, as well as providing support for refugees, humanitarian assistance, and these sorts of things.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a few more questions. Loretta would like to go back to the question about the name change, and it's asking about the etymology of the Myanmar name.
Yeah.
Why was it changed?
Why was it changed?
Yeah.
Because the military said that Burma was basically a colonial name, and which is true, and that Myanmar represented more all of the different communities in the country, which my understanding is that's not really true. It also pretty much represents the Bamar. So it's not a very, in addition to being just kind of an awkward name, it doesn't really represent. So when I said earlier that most people in the country call it Myanmar, a lot of the ethnic minorities still call it Burma. So neither name is ideal, but you know, I just stay out of that. That's something for the, you know, if they're able to throw off the military and work to build what they're trying to do, which is a federal democratic system like ours, then the people of the country can figure out whether they want to mess with a name change or just leave well enough alone.
We have time for just one last question. Do we have any questions in queue?
We have one more question. Edna would like to know, so we talked about the violence against the Rohingya. She is mentioning other victims such as Christians. Could you talk a little bit about that? What's going on? She's asking, any hope for religious liberty?
Yeah, I don't think it's fundamentally a religious issue, but I know what she's getting at. In the military's combat against multiple ethnic insurgent groups, some of those ethnic communities that are represented by the ethnic armed groups are either largely or at least partly Christian. Baptists, it was courtesy of American Baptist missionaries who went there a century or more ago, or some cases Anglican and Catholic. So the military's actions against them are because they're ethnic minorities, much more than because of their religion. And some people, you know, have debated this, but I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that Christians have suffered, but not fundamentally because they're Christians. Now, there is some prejudice, certainly, and discrimination against non-Buddhist, non-Bamar Buddhist. If you're a Bamar Buddhist, then, you know, particularly in the military, there's no limits. But if you're not, if you're either a Christian or just not Bamar, you're another ethnic minority, in the military, you can't really get past the rank of captain, major. And so there's those kinds of prejudices that are there. But in terms of the violence and human rights violations, it should be clear, the military's operations against some of these ethnic minority groups, they're targeting ethnic armed groups, but they're pretty indiscriminate. For decades, just devastating and horrific violence, including widespread use of sexual violence as a tool, have hit the Kachin, the Karen, the Shan, many others, some of whom are Christian, some of whom are Buddhist. It's just horrific. The stuff that we're seeing on the streets of Yangon, this is what the ethnic minorities in the border areas have been facing for decades. It's truly appalling stuff.
Thank you, Ambassador. Rose, you're muted.
Sorry. Is this better? Yes, okay. Ambassador, thank you so much for, for taking the time to address the council. Sadly, we have reached the end of our time together. But once again, thank you. And thank you for your participation. And Ambassador, what a phenomenal, fascinating presentation. I appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions so patiently. I appreciate it very much. In closing, I would like to encourage you all to join us again for our next webinar on North Korea with Ambassador Joseph Detrani. You can subscribe on our website and also receive future event invitations. Thank you once again and have a great evening.
Thank you.